Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Aaron Rosenblum. I'm the Health and Science Librarian at the Portland Public Library. I'll be your host this evening and the sort of Zoom host. So if you have any issues with the Zoom, feel free to contact me through the chat. Tonight's event is part of our 6th year of our sustainability series that we co-host with our partners at the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. And we're joined by Jess Burton, the Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, as always. We'll have a discussion and Q&A after the presentation, but during the presentation, I'll encourage you to drop your questions as they occur to you in the chat or using the Q&A feature here on Zoom. So either of those ways, just feel free to drop things in and we'll answer as many as time allows at the end. Before we go any further, I would like to offer PPL's land acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is a simple way of showing respect and a step toward correcting the stories and practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture, and toward inviting and honoring the truth. Portland Public Library would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the occupied and unceded territory of the Wabanaki, the people of the place where the sun first looks our way, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all the communities who have lived in Chuabunkeg for over 3,000 generations in what is now called New England and the Canadian Maritimes. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. So with that said, I am very excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Noah Perlut. He is a professor of biology at the University of New England. He traces the beginning of his career back to a single experience trout fishing in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Around the same time, at his undergraduate department's award party at James Madison University, he received the prestigious Most Likely to Have a Wildlife TV Show award. And now you've got it. This is your wildlife TV show with us here. That path led him from trout to the path that led him from trout to ornithology also led through an MA in environmental conservation education at NYU, a PhD in natural resources and postdoctoral work at the University of Vermont, and fieldwork throughout North and Central America, the Caribbean, and Hawaii. And so again, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Noah Perlut to the Sustainability Series.
All right, well, thank you so much for welcoming me, inviting me, both Aaron and Jess. I really appreciate it. Let me share my screen, we'll get going here. So I'm a professor at UNE in the School of Marine and Environmental Programs, and I do a lot of bird research, mostly with songbirds. When I first moved to Maine in 2009, I was visiting my wife in Portland, who worked in an office building on Mill Street. And I looked out her window and there was a herring gull nesting on the ledge of her window. And I was just immediately looked at her and like, how can you not share this information with me? This is amazing. And kind of from that moment have sort of added a project to understand the costs and benefits of gulls nesting in Portland to my lab group. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the fruits of that work and what we've learned over the last 10 or so years and somewhat hinting at where things are going. All right, let's get going here. So this is, I think, an appropriate way to start, a really kind of hilarious tweet from Europe where they were tracking some gulls and had an unusual pattern. And it turned out that these gulls were migrating back and forth a pretty long distance in Belgium to a potato chip factory. And I share this to start off with because we have so many impressions, I think, naturally of gulls as birds that are living off of our behavior, our food items, that they sit around and eat our French fries and pizza crusts, and that's what they do, and strategize how to steal our lobster rolls. And today I hope to convince you that is not actually the norm. The norm is the opposite to that, and that these gulls are doing really remarkable things, and they are using some of the habitats that we create in ways that might not have been able to imagine. with that, I have to share some context in that herring gulls in the Gulf of Maine are in a pretty steep decline. So the Breeding Bird Survey, which is really our kind of gold standard of how to assess population declines of birds in North America, shows that from the 1960s to now, we've seen a pretty significant decline in the number of herring gulls during the summer in the Gulf of Maine, declining around 4% a year, which is a lot. And you kind of imagine your own finances growing or declining 4% a year, compounding that over a 50-year period. That's a significant change. And so we have far fewer gulls here now than we did over time. And that results in a lot of opportunities as well. I do say this declines with a little bit of caution in that I have some new information that somewhat changes the story here. There was a great study done by a number of colleagues here in the state that looked at nesting data from 1977 to 2013. And over that time period, they found that the number of nests on islands declined by 17%, and the number of islands that were being used by herring gulls declined by 19%. So that data really pairs almost exactly the same parallels, the exact data that I just showed you previously. However, I just received some hot off the press data that's not published from colleagues, Linda Welch and her colleagues, who have been doing aerial surveys using airplanes, flying over colonies and taking photos of them, and then using some imagery to identify how many nests are found. So if you look at this figure here, from 2008 to 2013, that showed a decline in the number of nesting pairs from around 24,000 to 21,000. And that data kind of matches what I've showed you earlier. However, they flew in 2019 and found a remarkable increase in the number of birds, that over 25,000 nesting pairs. So I don't really have a great answer of what's going on, but this sort of adds a little confusion to it, whether the birds are still declining or stable in the Gulf of Maine, but nevertheless, things are going out. They're here, and there's lots to look at. So this leads me to Portland and the rooftops. And I want to show you some images of what a nesting colony looks like here in Portland. The birds are using, they're very particular in the habitats that they'll use. And this is a really common herring gull nest. And I should say, I might use the word gulls regularly. You won't hear me commonly use the word seagulls. When I say gulls, I'm really referring to herring gulls, which are the most common gulls in the Gulf of Maine. And they're really the only species that will nest on rooftops. So we'll just leave it at that. And their nests here are frequently pushed up against some sort of object on the roof, whether that's a piece of equipment or a ledge on the wall. And the roofs usually have some kind of complex structure to them. They really like roofs that have rocks on top of them. The rocks are holding down kind of mesh liners. And they also really like roofs that collect some water to feed their young. So their young can drink water. Sorry, not to feed their young, so the young can drink water. Here's a picture from the largest gull colony in Portland. This is from the Art Museum. And this is just a really common scene up there, where you've got these rocks, and this is a nesting pair, male and female together, looking at me very cautiously. And of course, in order to make young, they have to do what we all do to make young. This is a scene out of a friend's office building. He was just sitting there working and looked out the window, and there they were copulating. After you're done copulating, of course, you lay eggs. This is a picture of what a herring gull nest looks like right as it's hatching. And so you have an egg there and a chick that has just hatched within minutes of this picture. The gulls will lay between 1 and 3 eggs per nest, and I'll show you some data on that in a little bit. So they're really beautiful. They're bigger than a chicken egg. Here's another picture of what a nest kind of commonly looks like, with this one with eggs. And then once they're out and about, they run around Portland and they're feeding. This to me was a really classic picture of taken down on Commercial Street, a gull that had gone and stolen some bait, some herring bait from the lobster fisheries, right on the intertidal zone, hanging out. Of course, there's a cigarette butt there, which a lot of people would put to it. But importantly, I'm showing this picture because this gull has markings on its legs, and I am responsible for those markings. And so all the birds that I study, particularly all the chicks, receive leg bands in order for us to understand who they are and the decisions that they make along the way. So I'll be talking about here some different components of this. Sorry, give me one moment, please. Excuse me. Yeah, sorry, I needed to just check out there. Different components of this project, where I'm going to compare how gulls nest in 3 different places. The first comparison is Portland, the rooftops of Portland, with gulls nesting on a traditional island here in the Gulf of Maine. And this map shows what that comparison looks like. So Portland is with the gold star, and then I'll be comparing reproductive data for gulls with Appledore Island, which is in the Isle of Shoals, right on the New Hampshire border. So about 80 kilometers away, a quick flight for a herring gull. And we first wanted to understand the differences of rooftop nesting versus island nesting by looking at things like just their basic reproductive behavior. And so one of the first ways to ask that question is thinking about the number of eggs they lay, or what's called the clutch size. And this figure represents these data. On the left is the island habitat, and the right is the Portland nests. And you can see that on the island habitat, they average about 2.5 eggs per nest. And in Portland, they average just under that, about 2.2 or 2.3 eggs per nest. And so what this means is that the birds are laying about the same number of eggs, whether they're on the rooftops or the island. And so that, translates to resources. In that's a good sign that the resources that a female needs to lay eggs are sufficiently available, whether they're on an island or a rooftop. The story does change there significantly, in that we compared not only the number of eggs that were laid, but also what happened to those eggs. And I'll talk about this in 2 different ways, because it really is a telling story of these birds' lives on the rooftop. So let's first talk about the hatching probability. So the hatching probability is simply the probability that an egg will make the 30-day incubation period and hatch. Okay, so both females and males incubate, and it takes them 30 days to hatch. 0 would be that there's no chance that they're going to hatch. 1 would be that there's 100% chance that they'll hatch. And if you look at the data just for hatching probability, comparing Appledore Island and Portland, in 2011 and 2012, you can see that hatching was notably higher in Appledore than on Portland. And this is fairly easy to explain, in that on the island, the things that tend to cause eggs not to hatch is them being eaten mostly, or being washed away, but mostly being eaten. And gulls are largely the predators, they're eating other gulls' eggs, sometimes the same species, but commonly other species of gulls eating herring gulls. And that's the typical cause of failure for islands. In Portland, the cause of failure is quite different, in that we found that quite a few nests fail due to building management, managers not tolerating the nests on the rooftop. And the other way was through heavy rainstorms, where the water would pool up on the roof and carry the eggs away, and so the nests would fail. So you see the hatching probabilities. The chance that an egg will hatch is quite a bit greater on the island than in those rooftops. So the next thing you want to know is, okay, once it hatches, what happens to them? So it takes about another 30 days for a chick to be able to really grow and be mobile. And here you see with the 30-day survival of these chicks, that the story is exactly the opposite, where chick survival is notably lower on Appledore Island than it is on the Portland rooftops. And again, that is pretty easily explained in that the intensity of predation greatly increases on these chicks on the islands from other gulls because they're mobile. They're walking around, the parents aren't with them all the time. They're moving in rocks and shrubs, and other gulls are watching them and they're going after them and eating them more commonly. On the rooftop, the space is much more confined. And so the density of nests is much lower, but most important, blackback gulls are not present on rooftops, and blackback gulls are the main predator of herring gull chicks on islands. And so the lack of presence of this predator is probably the biggest thing that it differentiates their ability to survive. And so the outcome of this is, while the hatching probability is higher on islands, the survival rate is lower. We find that the fledging rate, the actual number of chicks that leave the rooftop or leave the island, is basically the same on rooftops as compared to islands. So we wanted to kind of look a little deeper about in this for the rooftops and try to understand what these guys are eating there. This is the messiest slide in the world, and I don't expect you to read it at all, at least in much detail. But as you kind of scan through it, you can just see words popping out. And the words that you see here are not pizza and ice cream and French fries. You're seeing natural food items, crabs, shells, fish. What this figure illustrates are prey items that chicks on rooftops were fed. So when we go in and ban the chicks, they frequently regurgitate food that's in their throat. And so we will collect these regurgitations and bring them back to the lab and analyze what they were actually fed. And so this is really good news. This is showing that chicks that are on rooftops, even though they're surrounded by human food, that their parents know what to feed them. They're feeding them good stuff, almost entirely marine foods. And when it's not marine food, they are feeding them things like insects. So high protein quality foods for sure. So interesting diet. And this is almost exactly the same as what you'd find as the diet of chicks on islands in the Gulf of Maine. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we are banning chicks, and I showed you a picture earlier, and I want to now talk about some of the information that we've gotten once they leave the rooftops. Excuse me. From 2011 to 2021, we banded a bit over 1,200 chicks. And you can see what these bands look like here. There's a metal band with a 9-digit number on it. And then there's a large plastic band that has 3 letters on it. And the plastic bands are orange. Each person that bands gulls has a unique color and combination of letters or numbers that they use. And so each gull chick is assigned a band that has a unique 3-letter code. So on the left, you see AAU. On the right, the chick I'm holding there is ART, art. Totally accidental, but not ironically, that bird was banded on the Portland Art Museum and should be their mascot for sure. So of these 1,200 or so birds that we've banded as chicks over the last 10 years, we've gotten information. People have seen them and reported them in some places. 20% of these birds, 250 of these individual birds have been resighted somewhere on this earth. A pretty remarkable rate as far as, in my view. The greatest time between banding and a resight was about 6 years long. Really incredible, showing these birds can live quite a long time, so over 2,100 days. And the farthest distance of a resight that's occurred is 2,700 kilometers, or just under 1,700 miles. And I want to show you now some data on what this looks like. So we catch the birds like this. They're in the nests. We put them in boxes just to keep them together and keep them calm and cool. Put the bands on their legs and let them go. They run around, and this is where they go. So this figure shows the resites for those 250 birds, this map. And you can really see some patterns here. So I'd like you to take a second and look at this map, because there's a few incredibly interesting trends to pick out. All right, the first trend is that some of these birds are going really far, really far. You'll see a bird in eastern Texas on the Gulf there. That bird fledged from its nest in Portland in July and was found in Texas feeding on the coast 3 months later. So that was a bird that was just a few months old, and it flew all the way there. We've had birds in Louisiana and Mississippi and Florida. So quite a long distance. But really the trend here that you see is that the vast majority of birds are being seen from southern New Jersey going north to Portland. They're really clustering in that area along the coast. And along the coast is a key point here too, in that only maybe 5 or 6 of our resites, of the 250 resites, have been inland. The ones that are inland have largely been at facilities, so things like landfills. We've had a couple at landfills and one at a compost facility. The other trend to take from this is that birds are not going north. We have had very few resites of gulls north of Portland. And one in Canada going due east, but remarkably few in general for sure. So that is all of the data combined, and there's so many pins there, it's sort of hard to really understand the patterns in the Northeast. So let me drill down here. All right, so this was the slide I just showed you, and I want to drill down a little bit to the Northeast, because this is where the vast majority of the resites are occurring, easily 90% of them. And you can really see some trends here about clustering along the coast, a fair number in the Delaware Bay, but then, boy, the number of birds that are hatched in Portland that spend time in New York City and around New York City is truly remarkable. And all over the city, the Bronx, they love Coney Island. There's tons of our birds have been resited at Coney Island, and then other parts going out Long Island. Really remarkable. Then you see them sort of a few in Massachusetts, quite in Rhode Island as well, and Connecticut, but in quite a bit up the coast as you go the northern coast of Massachusetts into New Hampshire, and then of course in Maine. All right, and so here's the map of everything that we've seen in Maine. And this is, I think, an important view, because you can see that the clustering is significant, that birds really are not going very far east or north. We've got a few random birds that have gone to Lewiston, one to Augusta, one to Topsom, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that bird in Topsom in a minute. And then we've got some birds that have been off the coast that have largely landed on lobster boats and been fed there. One of the birds was fed jalapeno cornbread and apparently really liked it. And then 2 birds on Mount Desert Rock out of Southwest Harbor. But largely really clustering in the Portland area for sure. Now, I started this talk cautioning you about assuming that these birds are eating French fries, but in fact, a small number of them have been seen at places like McDonald's and Burger King. And I asked you already to look at the map and think about what are the reasons for their distribution. And I guess now I'd like for you to think about an informal poll of gull preference. Do they prefer burgers and fries at McDonald's or Burger King? Drum roll, the answer is barely Burger King. So we've had 4 birds resighted feeding in parking lots at McDonald's, and 5 birds resighted feeding at parking lots of Burger King. But by and large, they are not feeding at fast food joints, which is a good thing for them for sure. All right, so I mentioned earlier that we have some study sites comparing Portland and Appledore Island, and I recently completed a study comparing Portland, Appledore Island, and then a nesting colony managed from colleagues at the College of Atlantic on Great Duck Island. Great Duck Island is just off the coast of Bar Harbor. And all 3 of these sites, we've been doing basically the exact same thing, where we're all banding chicks and seeing where they go. And I wanted to know how much these birds are interacting with each other. Are they mixing together? Are they going to the same places in the winter? How far are they dispersing? Here's some images of the difference in what these places look like. So Appledore Island is kind of a shrubby island. There's a number of buildings on the island that are academic buildings run by Cornell and University of New Hampshire. And there's people on the island constantly walking around. The gulls are really used to them. Portland in the middle, I'm showing you what that looks like. And then finally, Great Duck Island. Great Duck Island is more of a grassy island and is also the least visited island by people. It has a very low level of disturbance by humans. All right, so this is data that only goes through 2019. So it doesn't include a number of the points that I showed you earlier. And this is the distribution of movements across those islands. For yellow is still Portland. And then there's the blue is from Appledore and red is from Great Duck Island. And you can really see that there is no pattern, that all of these birds are going to effectively kind of the same places. They're all huddling along the coast, and they're all really staying between Delaware Bay and New Jersey, going north up to the Portland area. So lots of mixing, they're hanging out together. And I wanted to know, well, do they go different distances? And this figure compares just that, where it looks at how far these birds dispersed and across time, going from 2011 to 2018. So Appledore is blue, Portland is gray, Great Duck is orange. And essentially the trend is really consistent across time, where each year Appledore birds disperse the shortest distance, Portland in the middle, and Great Duck the longest. That is very simply a reflection of Great Duck being further north and east. And so these birds are just catching up to get to the same place. There's I think no other really explanation to that. So as part of the work in Portland, we've done some experimental work with adults as well. All of the data that I just showed you is really for birds that we originally banded as chicks, but we have caught some adults. Catching adults is kind of like watching a Tom and Jerry cartoon, where you see here we use a very complicated piece of technology, a box trap, and we put it over the nest. The birds walk around, go onto the nest, try to incubate their eggs. We've pulled their eggs, and we have fake eggs in there so they don't damage them. We pull a stick holding the trap up, the trap door closes, and then we go and take the bird out. This is what it looks like when we're handling one of the birds. We cover their eyes to keep them calm. Give them the same suite of bands that I showed you earlier, same color bands and metal bands. And with a small number of these, actually attach these satellite tags. And these satellite tags follow the birds real time, and they transmit very precise location points of where the gulls are at any given time. So those location points are, basically kind of as accurate as about a football field away. And they give these points 24 hours a day. They shoot the data up through cell phone towers. It's very easy to collect. Here's a picture of a bird that's fledging one of the rooftops, wearing one as well. So we put one on the chick once as well. And we did this for twice, once in 2017, one in 2018, and looked at these birds' movements. And these are the dates that the tags worked. And you can see that there is some variation. So one of the tags really only worked for a few days. Another tag worked for 3 months. One worked for 6 months, and another one worked for about 4 months. So here are their actual movements. This is real-time movements of these birds in downtown Portland. And this is all kinds of squiggly lines. And essentially what you're seeing is that the birds keep going back to the same place. That same place is where they're nesting, is where their chicks are. And then they go out and forage in all kinds of different areas all around the city. But what you don't see is them prowling the streets. There's not a lot of lines of them in downtown on buildings walking around. Here's an image of that kind of scaled out so you can see how far they're going to forage. Interestingly enough, they're going in different directions, right? So the bird in red was really moving out into some of the islands that's just off the Portland and South Portland coasts. The bird in blue was really moving north along the corridor that you see when you're driving along 295 into those mud flats. A little bit of southward movement. The one in blue, the darker blue, was really hanging out in the river in downtown Portland, and the yellow one was as well. So really variable movements, but importantly, movements that lead to them collecting natural food items, not commonly going to Burger King or McDonald's. So some of these tags actually worked for during all of the migration period. And here is 3 of those tags where you can see 2 of them, not surprisingly, went down to New York and New Jersey, where they stayed. And then one of them, which the yellow one, was the juvenile bird that I showed you, the hatchling, and that bird went down to the coast of North Carolina before the tag stopped working. So I want to show you some of the places that they're stopping along the way. This is the young bird stopping here right near Chesapeake Bay, in one of the rivers there. And you can see that this bird was kind of moving around along the river. It was stopping a little bit in agricultural fields, but really using natural habitats, marine or river habitats. So after it left Chesapeake Bay, it went down to a little bit inland near Richmond. But importantly, even in Richmond, it was hanging out in river areas, looking for food along waterways. It got into the Carolinas, and here in Carolinas, it did use a different kind of habitat. This is a landfill. So they went and congregated on landfill, and we found that gulls use landfills less for reasons than food and more for places where they can gather information. Unfortunately, we've also learned that going to landfills also leads to a high transmission of disease, and which can cause mortality. So that is a big downside of these types of visits. So that is really kind of the end of what I'd like to share with you today. And as a summary, first, living in the city for these gulls can be really good. It can be a safe place to raise chicks, and where chick survival can be just as good as islands. In these cities, they're feeding their chicks really good food, marine food. The birds that are coming from Portland are moving south along the coast. They primarily spend their winter between Delaware Bay, Long Island, and Massachusetts. And then finally, which you sort of have hinted at, but not kind of clearly shown, is that so much of what I've presented today is based on citizen science. And so what I mean by citizen science is just people who see these birds and report where they see them. I could never have any of these data about movements without citizens doing this. And that is unbelievably valuable tool for our work with wildlife. So last, I'd just like to thank this amazing group of colleagues, Peggy Fryer, and many, many students who've been involved out there getting bitten and pooped on by lots of gulls and chased. It's an intimidating situation to be on those rooftops. These birds can be quite aggressive, to say the least. And with that, I would be happy to open up to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that talk. It really hit a lot of the questions I had, but we have so many from our attendees. Thank you all, and you can keep putting those in the chat and the Q&A, and Jess and I will start asking them. And I think the first one that came in was from Elizabeth, and it says, what motivates herring gull migration for a gull a few months old to be found in Texas 3 months later? Why did it do that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. And I don't have an exact answer for you, but what I can give you kind of a picture of their life. These gulls don't start breeding until they're 4 or 5 years old. And so when you're a young gull, given that you have a long maturation time and that that gull predicts living a long time, easily into its teens, it's kind of like a gap year or a walkabout or what have you, in that they know that they're large-bodied and there's very few predators that can eat them. And so they kind of like to explore. They follow each other, they use social information from other gulls. And I think that they explore and learn and watch and figure things out over time. And they have a lot of time to do that, if they don't need to nest for at least 4 years. And so in some senses, why not move around? That being said, there are some gulls that every winter return to the exact same place. And I get the exact same resites from the same people who see them in the same place. And so related to that, I think there's personality differences within gulls, in that some like to move really broad distances and others are creatures of habit. I hope that sort of kind of answers your question as best I can.
Great.
That's great. That's cool. I love thinking of gulls as having a personality and having like their own independent story. Here's a question from someone who lives at 100 State Street, has been there for 2 years, and both years there have been nests on the roof, but not yet this year. Is it just not time for them? Or does that mean maybe they're not coming back? Or
it's just too early. Yeah, they won't lay their eggs till mid-May at the earliest. But you probably will see them hanging out and courting and doing their thing. If you're on 100 State Street, there's a pretty good sized colony on 75 State Street that has fledges maybe around 10 chicks every year. And a lot of gulls kind of congregate in that area. So I'd keep your eyes out. It's going to happen soon, just a little early. Everybody, I think, is anxious for spring.
That's great. We have I think a great kind of science process question from Wendy, which is, sightings seem to track human population density, where people can see and report sightings. So there's nowhere where there's more people than, on the East Coast than New York City, just to have people looking for them, right? So is that playing into this at all?
I don't think it is, actually, because there's lots of people in New York City, but that doesn't mean they're walking around with binoculars.
True.
Right. And so I think that it's really a function of the East Coast is so developed. It's so developed. Yes, there's conserved beaches, but those conserved beaches are actively used by people. They're not just left alone and not visited. And gulls are rather social, right? They're rather social. And so there's birders out all over the East Coast, and people just see them. And I should say it's not only birders that are reporting these. Some of these animals that I've talked about today have been collected. So which means, for example, there's some programs at landfills and airports where agencies have permits to actually remove these birds. And so some of the birds have been removed, killed in that process, and then they've reported the bands to me. Other birds have washed up on the shore, and people have found the bird or parts of the bird with bands. Some hit by cars or brought to wildlife rehabilitation centers. So it's birders are a big source of information, but there's others as well.
We have 3 questions that came in literally at the same minute, and they're like so many questions. So hopefully we can get to all of them. But I'm going to ask this question from Jean. Why do the birds swarm in the middle of the night at the corner of Middle and Pearl Streets?
What, Middle and Pearl Street? Yeah, in the middle of the night, huh? So I haven't seen that exactly. Are there lights there? And but one way or the other, they are social animals, and so they're sharing information, just like crows share information. When you see congregations of crows, they are socializing, they're addressing each other, they are constantly paying attention to each other. And the thing about birds is that you look at a herring gull, and for most of them, they look identical to you, right? One herring gull looks like another, one chickadee looks like another. For their eyes, they are as different to each other as we are amongst ourselves. They see those differences as clearly as we do. And so you have to keep that in mind, that there's a real difference in perspective of socialization. And for a long-lived animal like that, socialization is super important. Getting information about where to find food, mates, places that are dangerous, where predators are. So my guess is that what you're seeing is some component of socialization there, for sure.
Great. And I hope it's not too loud for Jean's sake. Another question was from Donna, is when a tag stops working, does that mean the battery is dead or that it fell off or what? I assume that's the transmitters.
Yeah, the tag stop working could be a number of things. One, that it fell off the bird. That's the most likely scenario. Or 2, that the actual device stopped working. The birds can peck at it and break it sometimes. But most likely the tag fell off, and then the solar panels it flipped over, was covered, or dropped in the water. And so it stopped charging and stopped transmitting.
Awesome. So we have 2 questions that are pretty much the same. When birds leave to go to New Jersey or New York, do they come back? And might that be because they want to breed, or are there other reasons? Yeah.
One of the main questions that I want to answer with these bands is whether or not birds that are hatched in Portland return to nest in Portland 4 or 5 years later. And what I've found so far is that no, they're not. There's other birds that are moving in here to nest. And so it's tough for me to answer your question in a lot of respects, but I can tell you that at this point, only a very small number of birds are nesting on rooftops after having been hatched on rooftops. So where they're going and coming back, on other islands, there's a lot of site fidelity where gulls do come back to the same islands and nest, often very close to where they nested before, but not always exactly where they nested before, but frequently on the same island as past nesting. Likewise, sometimes they'll nest with mates that they had previously, but not always.
Okay, and we had that as a question that came in a little later of whether they mate for life.
They do not mate for life.
We had someone looking for a clarification on what you said about when they go to landfills, asking that when you say they go to landfills, less for food and more for information, what do you mean?
Yeah, so landfills are fairly safe places to sit around. There's not a lot, they can see really far. They're usually up high a little bit, and so they can see any potential predators that might come after them. Anything from like a peregrine falcon or something on the ground like a fox or a house cat. And so they're relatively safe places to roost, particularly when there's large numbers of them. When they can accumulate in large groups, there's more eyes out watching. And when they're in these groups, they look at each other and said, hey, how well fed is that bird next to me? And how well fed is that bird next to me? And if I'm hungry and that bird looks really well fed, then the next morning when we're all leaving to go out and forage, I'm going to follow that bird and see where it goes. And I'm going to feed in areas that that bird's feeding. And so that's the kind of thing that I mean by sharing social information at these sites, where they can learn about places to feed, they can learn about places to be safe from predators, and gather just general information. To our knowledge, they are not doing anything with respect to finding mates or anything like that. There's some sea ducks that are here all winter that actually are looking for pairs. That doesn't seem to be the case for these gulls.
That's super cool. Okay, we have another question about the neighborhood activities. This person lives on Franklin Street and looks out at Lincoln Park. Every morning, a woman feeds the gulls, which is fun to watch, but we wonder if it's a bad thing to be doing. We don't know what she's feeding them, but wonder if anyone in the city monitors such feedings.
No, nobody in the city monitors them for sure. You know, whether it's a bad thing or not, I don't know how that's different from somebody putting out a bird feeder. You know, is that appreciably different? My gut is no, and that I would expect that these gulls are only a tiny percentage of their actual daily diet is coming from eating that food. There's been a number of studies with bird feeders showing that at most 15% of a bird's daily diet is coming from a bird feeder. So I would suspect it's a pretty small percentage, except for perhaps a couple individuals that have really linked into it. But in general, I don't think it's really an issue.
Great. We have two that are similar. One is, and that was a perfect lead-in with the bird feeders. How do gulls interact with other urban birds? And then we had it asked another way, as have Portland gulls grown into any kind of meaningful relationship or typical interaction with Portland's pigeon population?
Yeah, so no interaction with pigeons at all. I would think that, in fact, some of these gulls might try to eat some of the pigeons that would their chicks if they could. I think that would be a tasty treat for a gull. They really don't interact with other birds. I can say that I've seen them respond to raptors that have flown through. Like there's 2 peregrine falcon nests around Portland. Sometimes there's osprey cruising around, but they largely ignore most things. They're so large bodied that there's not really an issue, and they completely ignore the songbirds that are around. So that there's really not a whole lot of interaction for them. I would suspect that they're more wary of mammals, that they're interacting more with mammals. It's kind of an interesting story. There's I mentioned earlier that the Portland Art Museum has the largest colony in the city, and there's these different tiers to it. One of the tier, the lowest one, has some trees that kind of come up next to it. And in 1 year of banning chicks there, we showed up there in late June to ban the chicks. And normally on this one floor, I would expect to find maybe 15 chicks. There were 0. They had all been eaten. I think a raccoon had climbed up onto up the trees and onto the rooftop and eaten all of the chicks overnight, one night. But it couldn't climb to the other levels. And so all the chicks on the other levels were perfectly fine. So my gut is that their interactions are more with things like that, or squirrels coming up on rooftops, than it is really many other birds around.
We have a lot of questions about courting and mating. So you answered the question about mating for life, but folks, we have a bunch of avid birders in the group and who watch gulls, and they are observing what seems to be return trips, both from the chicks to the grown gulls to their nests, and then also mates coming back together every year. And then also wondering if you could talk about their courtship. Do they have any sort of behaviors when they're courting?
Yeah, courting is actually very, very complicated for them. They have a series of neck and throat and postures, movements with their throats, the way that they stay together. They spend a lot of time walking in parallel with each other. They don't necessarily have a display, but they will do a duet where they'll call together, they'll face each other and they'll call. And there's just a persistent, and there is courtship feeding, I should say. There's consistent courtship feeding for sure of males feeding the females, both before they lay eggs, during nest building, and while they're incubating. So that's a lot of the behavior. And gulls really have kind of 3 or 4 main types of calls, and they have, each of those calls mean something different, and they have different roles during their courtship period. And so you really kind of sort of watch them, and you'll see that as they're together. So sorry, that was the courtship component. Can you tell me again what other part of that question I can answer?
So once they find each other and mate, do those same couples return every year to mate with each other? Maybe not for life, but do they do it repeatedly? And then sort of related to that, do they always come back to the same nest? Well, you sort of talked about that a little bit earlier, but.
So the nest itself is not reused. The nest is largely made out of vegetation that kind of gets washed away or composts. The nest, so no. I think, yes, they will renest with the same pair. Typically, these gulls don't renest within a given season. If they fail really early, they might renest. But if they fail like in June, they're just done breeding for the year. And they kind of hang out in the colony. They frequently will hang out in the colony and not travel yet until the other chicks fledge. Largely it's just a hormonal component where they want to be nesting. They want to be there. They want to be feeding chicks, but they don't have any chicks to feed. And they will renest with each other in consecutive years as well. But the divorce rates sort of vary over time. There is some evidence from Appledore Island that gulls have been skipping a year between breeding more commonly than we might have predicted. And the thought might be that the changes in food resources in the Gulf of Maine are leading to that skipping, in that the food that they're used to predicting is moving further north, and the food that's moved in to the Gulf of Maine is just harder to access because gulls can't dive underwater, right? They feed on the surface, or they feed in mud flats. So that's potentially related to this skipping between years. And the skipping between years has real consequences for your fidelity to your mate. You know, if your mate comes back and wants to nest, but you're not able to because you're not fit, then they're going to find a new mate or try to find a new mate.
Thanks. I had wondered about that. We do have more attendee questions, but I'm going to just insert one in because it's related. I've spent a lot of time in my childhood and my adulthood on Penobscot Bay, and in the place I've spent the most time as a child, I would constantly see lots of gulls pulling up from among the many thousands of mussels that were around and freely available at low tide, flying up in the air, dropping them to break them open and eating them. Great, how clever. There are no mussels around, in this particular part of Penobscot Bay in Northport anymore that are visible, at least on the coast side. I don't know about out on the other side of the bay in Islesboro, et cetera. And gulls are still around, but not in the same numbers. And I was just wondering about if you have much to go on in terms of data on the other changes in our waters and in the populations of herring for the herring gulls or mussels or the other food items.
So I unfortunately don't, and I understand your question, but I don't have any really good anecdotes to share to speak to that question.
Well, fine then. How about this one? We have a question of Here in Gorham, a neighbor places corn for deer and turkey, and the gulls also eat it. Is corn acceptable for gulls? And I would just expand that to say, do they know what they should eat, kind of, or are they omnivores?
I mean, everybody wants to eat corn because it's sweet and delicious and full of starches. So it's the same reason that you go to McDonald's, right? It's a little bit of junk food from time to time is okay, and not going to be a problem at all. The same is true for the turkey and deer. It's just a minor food item.
I'm going to have to jump off shortly, so I just wanted to say thank you. But I know that you and Aaron can stay on a little bit longer if everybody else is able to stay. And there are lots more questions in the chat. But I also have a question. So you made reference to citizen science or community science as a way to track the gulls. Is there a specific site that you use to track your gulls?
Yeah, there's a few different ways to get resites. The most traditional way is the bird banding lab, which is the part of the U.S. Geological Service, maintains a website where people can report any banded bird that they see or find. And what happens is that they report that information, and then whoever reports it receives back the information about where that bird was originally banded. And then the bander receives the information that was submitted by the person. And this is a system that's linked between Canada and the US. So we're all collaborating to it. So that's the first most traditional way. The other way is through social media and online picture sites, where there's a remarkable amount of information that's shared, particularly on Facebook or through the main birds list. On Facebook, for example, there's an incredible gull page that is so incredibly active with people who just love gulls and spend so much time looking at and thinking about gulls. There's also the main birds page. And so these things get posted, and then somebody sees it and says, oh, I know Noah tags these birds, so let me message him or let him know that it's up here. That's another way to get information.
That's super cool. I love that. Thank you. Thanks so much too. Yeah.
Oh, you
Great.
bet. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jess. And yeah, we'll stay here and keep answering questions for the rest of folks for a bit. But we know you have to run along, so we'll see you soon. But back to these other questions, we have covered several of them with previous answers, kind of about the nesting behavior and courtship behavior. We have a question about the social information and individual personality of gulls you've been talking about. They're wondering if there are any books on herring gull behavior that you could recommend that describe their behavior and individual personality, and also are different herring gull colonies as a whole likely to have entirely different behaviors and cultures. For example, herring gull colonies in the Bay of Fundy seem really different and more serene than Portland herring gulls.
Yeah. So for the resources, I would say for the folks, whoever put that chat, just to email me and I can provide some resources. My email is I don't know if I should, maybe I can put it up in the chat.
I can type it in while you talk. I know your email.
Okay. So, and then as far as personalities go, absolutely amongst colonies for sure. And I think that's a reflection of the proximity to humans. You know, the really remote ones are just going to respond differently to humans than the ones that are in Portland or so for sure what you're seeing is real. Their behaviors are different. Their comfort level with people is different based on the geography.
All right, and we do have just a couple more. And this is another kind of interbird behavior one, maybe, and with humans. Today there was a swarm of gulls circling over Whole Foods Market and screaming. I saw this. I'm not the questioner, but I did see this. There appeared to be a very small group of crows nearby and interacting with the much larger group of gulls. It appeared to be a colossal contest between gulls and crows. The gulls were circling above the crows. So were they interacting or just everybody likes Whole Foods.
No, they were definitely interacting, but there might have been a third part that was not seen, in that there might have been a raptor around there that the gulls were, or the crows were hazing, and that the gulls picked up on that and were there to haze as well. Whether the raptor had been chased off or not, or was still there, I can't say, but I would bet that was related to a raptor having been there at some point.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I wonder that often in speaking to other bird experts and biologists, that often seems to be an answer to what was going on there, is maybe there was a raptor around.
Yeah.
If everyone was agitated, maybe there was a raptor around.
Yeah. I did just see a question about the bird at the Topsom. Yeah, so the story of that was at the McDonald's in Topsom, right near the mall there, or that exit where all the strip malls are. And the person that recited the gull there decided to do a food experiment with the gull, where they went in and bought a whole bunch of things on the menu, laid them all out in front of the gull to see what they preferred. And ironically, the gull preferred chicken nuggets the most. So,
well,
such as
it didn't know it was a chicken nugget, or maybe it did. All right, we just have a couple more. We have someone who lives in a condo complex across from the back cove. We frequently have a congregation of 20 or more gulls on a large grassy lawn, with interesting coming and going patterns. Why would they gather there? What do you think is attracting them in that area?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing that I kind of mentioned earlier. When you think about Back Bay, Back Cove, it's close to places they can feed when the tide is coming and going. There's some level of trash they could feed on if they needed to. That was, people feeding around there. But they can also see well, right? When you're standing in the middle of a grass field and you're with 20 other gulls, it's really easy to both look around and to share information about what's going on. So my guess is that that's a big part of it, the safety of it, the information sharing of it, and the proximity to feeding places to feed at tide changes.
Great. Okay, and I think this might be the last question. I think we've covered them. Is there any oversight or input into the demolition of buildings and requiring developers to avoid nesting season? Thinking particularly of the proposed plan to demolish the old Press Herald printing press building, which has quite a few nests each year.
No, not at all. There's no planning around that. That being said, there are very clear and strong federal laws about what can and cannot happen to a nest as soon as there is a single egg in it. Anybody can remove a gull nest when it's just the nesting material, but you cannot touch the nest as soon as there's an egg in it or a chick around. There is one federal agency that is allowed to do that. And so whenever a building has a nest that they need removed for whatever reason, they have to essentially kind of hire this federal agency to come to Portland and remove the nest. And they have permission to do it. And so my guess is if a building is going to be taken down and there are active nests in it, that APHIS needs to come and remove the nests before that happens.
Great. Yeah, I wondered that too. Although now that I have the information gained in this presentation, I also know that there's it's not because there are no island nest sites anymore, and the buildings maybe are one adaptation and not the only option.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we've covered all the questions, which is great. Thank you for taking the time to answer all of them.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure.
Oh, one more popped up. So if you have time.
Sure, happy to answer one more.
All right. They even started it with last question. In your observation, so it will be, in your observations of gulls and how they share and gather information, are there languages, they put in quotes, that the herring gulls seem to speak or have meaning?
I'm going to make the answer that I'm going to give you is an inference from a different experience, but I think it's really related. I don't hear any essentially sort of dialects around Portland. They, to me, sound fairly similar. I'm sure they are. I just haven't teased them apart. But I have a project with a songbird that does show dialects at fairly small ranges. And so I would be really surprised if herring gulls, when you think about them going nesting across the Gulf of Maine, if there aren't really interesting dialects across that distribution of, whatever, a couple hundred miles. So I bet it exists, and that a gull could tell you, yeah, that they sound like they're from, the southern part of the Gulf versus the northern part of the Gulf. So I would be very surprised if that doesn't exist, but I haven't actually seen it myself.
Okay, great, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and once again, thank you for presenting. To those who are still with us, we'll be back next month on the 25th with a panel discussion about PFAS contamination. Oh, we should have asked you how that affects birds. Oh well, next time. So we'll hope to see you then. That'll be on Zoom too. Thanks a lot, Dr. Perlut, and everybody have a wonderful night.